calling in from Austin, Texas, where I now live. I'm originally from the UK, from Britain, but I've been an American citizen for about 40 years, most of that time living in Richmond, Virginia, where I worked with Ebony, who will introduce herself in a moment. And we were involved in much of the training that's going on and the creation of some of the trust building models that we're going to be using today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rob. So excited to be here. My name is Ebony Walden. I live in the U.S. As Rob said, I'm actually originally from New York, but been living in Virginia for about 18 years. In Richmond specifically for about 7. And I think I've been involved in the initiatives of change here since I got here. So I am one of the lead co-facilitators for our trust building program here. I went through it 7 years ago. And I also have my own consultant firm where I do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work with organizations throughout the US, specifically discussing race, which is kind of our big conflict here, or one of them. So glad to be here and glad to be co-facilitating with Rob.
So the trust building program is, as you all know, hosted by the Initiatives of Change International. And I think we're now working with teams in 7 different countries around the world. And so what we're going to do today is give you really just a taster of the program. So the trust building program, again, is Ebony and Rob. So our goals for today, we want to review some of the key principles of trust building. We're going to engage in some activities together, some conversation, and some times of personal reflection. And we're going to illustrate with some stories, some examples of trust building from Richmond, Virginia. So why are we talking about trust? Why is trust important? Well, I think many of us would agree that trust is really social capital. It's the foundation of democracy. And I think in all of our countries, we're finding that without trust, it's really almost impossible to tackle the most urgent needs in our society. I think the biggest challenges the world faces today are not technical. I mean, in the United States, just the other day, we sent a spaceship 131 million miles to Mars, a very successful spacecraft. And at the same time, we've got hundreds of thousands of people in this country who simply refuse to accept science, the medical science of COVID, and refuse to wear masks. And so we have many, many more people dying than should be dying, right? That's not a technical problem, right? That's a human problem. And so we say what we need is adaptive change. And by adaptive change, we mean new learning, new attitudes, new relationships, new behavior, which leads to trust. And the purpose of the trust building program, it's more than just a training program, right? I mean, our goal really is to equip community leaders at all levels with the inner qualities and the skills to build trust across deep divides, to heal historical wounds, to bring together diverse groups in honest conversation, and develop and to sustain diverse teams and multi-sector networks working for social cohesion and equity. I hope all of you will have taken a look at the short video overview, which gives you some sense of what we mean by that. So we have these 4 sort of key components of the trust building program. Starting with ourselves, this whole theme of change starts with me, healing historical wounds, engaging everyone in honest conversation, and building teams. And this is not a linear process. These things are all connected, right? But these are the 4 key components. So I'm going to ask Ebony to lead us into a short reflection as we start off.
So you're gonna need a good amount of pen and paper for our time, because we're gonna be doing a lot of reflection activities. Just so it's the morning, it's probably the afternoon, somewhere, wherever you are in your day. It's hard to look at a screen for 2 hours. So we're trying to make it interactive. So the first thing we want you to do is kind of reflect on your own experience of trust. So reflect on, take a minute or two, and then we'll break you into groups. A time where you were trusted. How did that feel? And a time where you were not trusted. How did that feel? So it could be yesterday, it could be at work, it could be at home, wherever in your life. A time where you're trusted. You don't have to, in like maybe one sentence about how that feel. A time where you weren't, and how did that feel? So take a minute to think about that, jot down any ideas you have. And then we're going to send you into groups of 3 to discuss where has trust been broken, or where does it need to be built in your community, neighborhood, school, or family, right? So you came to a workshop on trust building because presumably you want to build trust. So where does trust need to be built, or where has it been broken in one of the places where you are connected to? So take about 30 seconds to think about those 2 questions. And then Elena, we can send them into groups of 3. So you'll have about 5 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes to talk about that in groups of 3. Talk about how it felt to be trusted and not trusted, and where you need to build trust in your community. Would y'all like to share? And y'all came to a trust building teaser. Trust must be broken or built in some place in your communities. Where are those places for you? Between
for
what
me,
group?
okay. My name is Julius from Nigeria. My group, I relate my experience in my working community, my previous employment, where the CEO actually, trusted me with some key positions and what to do, and which I understood that it made me feel very good. It made me feel it increased my potential. But at the end of the day, my other co-employees didn't feel good about it, and they didn't feel the same way that I felt, and they saw me as a challenge, or became a, instead of trust that I had worked for and earned, to be a sort of motivation to them. In turn made me, well, the opposite to them, because they saw me in a different light. They saw that I've been given so much privileges and so many other things. But I know within me, I had worked for good 8 years to be able to earn this trust, and for the CEO to entrust me with this position. And so sometimes, working towards being trusted and being trusted can come with mixed bags of feelings.
Yeah, exactly. Like the same thing that you felt like built trust between you and the CEO is exhibiting trust, was unbeknownst to you sort of breaking trust with the rest of the staff, right? So it's complicated, right? And a lot of times it's unintended or byproducts of things where people feel like trust is broken, when that may or may not have been your intention, but that was the impact, right? So thanks for bringing that up. That's a really good example. Other folks, either where you felt like trust, how it felt like to be trusted or not trusted, or where in your particular community or context does trust need to be built? Fatima, go ahead.
Yeah, so when I was trusted, I remember right from my childhood when I was in school, and there was a selection from teachers for buddy counselors, selecting those students who can be a good listener and who can be good helpers to some children. And I was selected for that. And that was the biggest wow moment for me, aha moment. And that gave me the kind of feedback that people trust me and they find those qualities in me, that I'm a good listener. So from that day onwards, this feeling of people trusting you is overwhelming, and it gives you a lot of responsibility as well. So that makes you much more responsible, and then you start grooming yourself to be one trustworthy person. And probably that is the reason for me to choose my career also, because I'm practicing practicing counselor and practicing psychotherapist and clinical psychologist, and my job requires for people to trust me. So probably that is the reason. When the trust was broken, fortunately for me in my personal life, I don't have any memories or any incidents which I feel that people did not trust me.
Okay.
But when I think largely, because I live in India, as a community, of course, I feel very bitter about certain things, because I think as a community of Muslims, the trust was broken.
Mm.
I feel because I have those qualities and people trust me and I'm a good listener and helper, I can actually play a key role in bringing the communities together and do something about it, the trust building exercises. So that's how I'm involved with IOFC. I'm at present the trustee of IOFC India, and I think I can play a key role. And that's how my objective to join this course. So I want to learn more strategies and skills on how to deal with difficult spaces, difficult situations, and some more of it. So just to empower me to be.
Thanks, Fatima. Really, really powerful examples of, we know how it feels to be trusted, right? There's a sense of responsibility. There's a sense of joy, maybe even be heavy because you have to like live up to that particular trust. And obviously personal trust of, listening. When you're listening, then people really trust you with the emotional stuff of their life. But what does it mean for you to be building trust within the Muslim community, in the community that you're in, right? So really, really good examples. How about one more before we move on? Either where you in your life have felt trusted or not trusted. Go ahead.
My name is Mangalam, and I'm working in Toronto with the Sri Lankan diaspora, Tamils and Sinhalese, and I'm trying to build relationship between the two groups, and I find that it's impossible because they don't trust each other, and especially the Tamils, they are the victims, and they really don't want any reconciliation. And I used to wonder, why is that they cannot, at least try to come together. And I remembered certain incidents in Sri Lanka when I was a young teenager. I used to wonder why this is happening. So the minority Tamils living in the Sinhalese areas, they go and start a business. But then when the trouble comes, they be hurt. Their business is burned and destroyed, even lives are destroyed. And then they move on to another place. And then they have to start again. So they start another small business. And this happens very often, one after the other, periodically. So I was thinking then, how can you trust then, when you are hurt through systematically, how can you trust and build trust again with the government or with the ethnic groups? And so I read some of the materials of Rob, and I see that how these deep rooted wounds, it's there. It has to be healed before you create trust. So I was so discouraged, and I said, my goodness, how it might take years and years for me to build this. I might die before that. So that is the reason I think I opted for this, and to say how this is a complex situation and a long-standing, and I am really, really looking for some help to do some healing with these people. And it's not one or two person, it's a 300,000 diaspora Tamils only here. And this happens only to the victims. I don't think the Sinhalese feel the same way because they are not in the position of they didn't go through all this. They were always protected by the government. So this is my problem. Yeah, it's a community, how to build a trusting community.
Yeah, and hopefully, Magdalene, we can give you some share some of our experience of building trust in Richmond, right? And sometimes looking at a community of 300,000 people that you have to build trust with is daunting. But if you can start with a solid group of 10 or 15 or 20 people, that's where you have to start with people that want to have the conversation. If you think about 300,000 people, you know, it seems overwhelming. But if you can begin with small groups of people, and that's how we began in Richmond. And with that, I think that's a really good segue for us to get into some of the lessons learned from Richmond that we can share with you all about how we did a bit of that. And it's still an ongoing process, right? I'm sure you all see the news from stuff going on in the US and protests and things. So it's still a process that we're going through all across our country. So it's a long game. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob and we can get in some of the top content. But thanks for sharing. We just wanted to root y'all into what it feels like to have trusted, to be trusted, and what it feels like for that to be broken, and to think about what are the broken places in your community that you want to think about as we move through this training today.
So we're going to take the first piece we're going to look at is this whole question of starting with ourselves, or personal authenticity. How do I become an authentic leader? I was talking with a community leader in a town south of Atlanta, Georgia, just this past week. And he took part in the Trust Building Fellowship Program in Richmond a couple of years back. And he's now the first executive director of what they're calling Trust Building Incorporated in LaGrange, Georgia. They're doing trust building work there. And they're doing some remarkable work. And he said to me, he said, modeling the change is the most important thing that I learned. He said, it helps me to overcome my first instinct and to stay open. And so he was just describing how that was so important for his work. I think failure to root social justice efforts in a strong inner life and lived out values can endanger the most idealistic efforts. And as Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners, says, we need to be both personally responsible and socially just. Both of these things need to go together. And I'm always very struck by the words of Howard Thurman, who was one of the great civil rights leaders, theologians in this country, where he says, the root of what I condemn in others is found at long last in the soil of my own backyard. The root of what I condemn in others is found at long last in the soil of my own backyard. And he went on to say, what I seek to eradicate in society, I must first attack in my own heart and life. There is no substitute for this. And I was thinking of some of my own experience when I first arrived in Richmond many years ago. Richmond, at that time, was a very, very, very conservative place. And I come from a labor background. My dad was a trade unionist. And when I found myself in Richmond, which, as many of you know, was in the 19th century, a center for the slave trade in the United States. It was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And it led, in many ways, was one of the leaders of the drive to maintain segregation right up until the early 1970s. And so you had a very, very conservative environment there. And I found myself becoming very frustrated and you might say very judgmental of many of the people that I was trying to work with. And I was fortunate at that time to get to know a guy called John Coleman. John was a lay preacher, an African-American lay preacher in Richmond. And he became a real mentor to me. And I remember him saying, he said, the bridge of trust must be strong enough to bear the weight of the truth that you are trying to deliver. You need to build a bridge of trust that is strong enough to bear the weight of the truth that you are trying to deliver. And I realized that it was not my job to try and convert anyone to my way of thinking. It was not my job to judge anybody, but I might even have something to learn from some of the people that I was finding so difficult. And I think that, in a way, opened my own heart and made it possible for us to begin to develop spaces where people of all different backgrounds felt welcome to participate, whether they be community leaders or business leaders or government leaders. So for me, this has always been a central theme in my own life. how do we build a bridge of trust as we go forward? And that depends on our own authenticity and building awareness and a strong inner life. You know, what are the resources? Doing this work is hard work, as you all know. It takes a lot of inner strength to maintain this. Otherwise, we get burned out. So we have to make sure we're taking time in reflection. We need to have clear values for both private and public action. I need to be aware of my own privilege, my own unconscious bias. In what areas do I experience privilege as a white male American, right? What are some of the biases that I need to recognize? And what are some of the, what we call triggers or hot buttons? What are some of the things that are the unhealed wounds in my own life that cause me to react in certain ways to certain people or certain situations? So becoming aware of these things becomes really, really important. So we're just going to take a few minutes just to think about, and we can use the chat room for this, I think. I'm going to invite all of you just to write down one value that you think is important for building trust, okay? We can put this in the chat room. Just put down one value that you think, from your own experience, is important in building trust. Okay, so someone's put down mindfulness,
compassion,
prudence, honesty, spirituality, passion, respect, commitment, yes. So these are all important values. And you know, there are many things that go into, here's another one, ability to listen. Yeah. I like to think about often, you know, in initiatives to change, we talk about 4 standards or 4 values that are important to our life. And I like to look at them as sort of building blocks of trust. And for me, I look at it like honesty about my failures, purity in my motives, unselfishness in my support of others, and love in my readiness to forgive and to accept forgiveness. And I'm sure you all have different ways of expressing these, but I find it helpful to have, you know, clear benchmarks for both my private and public action. And then taking time in quiet. I mean, today, many forms of meditation and mindfulness are being practiced by people all over the world now. People of many different faiths and people who are not necessarily part of any faith tradition. And I think it's fair to say that brain science is showing us the benefit of such practices. It's being used in corporations now, it's being used in schools. But I think also, while many contemporary forms of meditation focus exclusively on the self, the quiet time, as experienced in initiatives of change, connects us with both our true self, our inner compass, or God, if we want to call it that, and with other people and with practical life. So I love this expression, which I think Jean Brown from Australia first developed, calling it a time of connection, a time of correction, and a time of direction. Time of connection with my own true self. For me, as a Christian, the voice of God, my inner voice. A time of correction, because I find every day there are some things that I need to take a look at and correct and put right and apologize for. And a time of direction, because I think the quiet time is also a very important, you might say, strategic tool for reaching out to other people, to our communities, to understanding, a time of discernment. And I know that for my wife and myself and our family, that's a very important thing. I mean, it's that first hour in the morning for my wife and I is the most important hour of the day. And it really helps us to get clear build our own relationship, our family relationship, but also thinking about the people around us. So just one very quick example of this. This picture was taken a long time ago, as you can see, when we were all much younger. But this is a picture of Susan, my wife, and myself with our two neighbors in Richmond, Collie and Audrey Burton, who were civil rights activists who helped to register voters, which led to the first Black majority in Richmond City Council in 1977. And they began to use these tools of quiet time, reflection, self-examination, forced standards, and so forth. And they decided that they were going to reach out to a person who they found extremely difficult. He was a white assistant city manager, very well-known person, a person who they deeply distrusted and felt carried racist attitudes, but they decided to reach out to him. They invited him to their home. They began to work with him. They agreed to have honest conversation together. Mr. Howe Todd, he's the one on the left of the picture there. And the impact of that friendship and that honest friendship was such that people noticed. And I remember meeting with a leader of a black community organization in Richmond, and he said, "What has happened to Mr. Todd?" He said, "He used to be known as a person who never listened. Whenever I went into a meeting, I always felt that the decisions were already made. Now he actually listens to what I have to say." And that relationship, that changed relationship between Mr. Todd, Howe Todd, and Collie Burton, the community leader, was like sending ripples across the community because people noticed the change. So that demonstration of changed lives said more than any amount of advocacy. And it led to many, many other changes taking place. And we often say that trust building is not a skill that is taught, but a spirit that is caught. Not a skill that is taught, a spirit that is caught. And if we have that spirit, other people will catch it and they will identify with it. So we're going to just do a little bit of personal reflection right now. This is your own reflection time for just a couple of minutes. Just think about, and again, you can take out your pen and paper. When you think about being a trust builder, what seems like your own biggest personal strength and your biggest personal challenge? When you think about being a trust builder, what seems like your own biggest personal strength and your own biggest personal challenge? Let's just take a couple of minutes just quietly to reflect on that. So I would encourage you to, keep track of what you note there. This is your own sort of personal reflection, your own personal homework. You may want to think about this question more later on. But I'm going to hand it right back now to Ebony to take us on to our next part of the program.
Thanks, Rob. So Rob shared with us the first pillar, which is to start with yourself. In our trust building paradigm here in Richmond. And the second is healing the wounds of history, the power of story, right? And one of our colleagues says, pain that is not transformed is transferred. So a lot of us are dealing, which this is what Mangalam was talking about as well, is the history of these wounds that people bring personally, but also what's going on in our context, in our country, that is really, really painful. And so in order to build trust between any communities or any people or persons, you have to really address and tell the truth about that history. And so in Richmond, we've primarily worked for the past, or Rob really has been working for the past 30 years to address the issue of race as it began in this country, not only with the taking of land from Native Americans, but specifically the enslavement of Africans in this country, and how that sort of those beginning sins have really shaped us as country, and the ongoing and continual hurt, right? So our focus has been to healing those particular wounds. And in order to do that, we thought it was really important to change the narrative around what those were, right? So in a lot of US history, some of these things are not even, the truth is not told, right? And there's still textbooks today that said that Africans were brought here as willing workers, which is kind of mind-boggling. So this narrative change about what really happened were the first things that need to happen. And narrative change is like, what are the stories in which we tell ourselves? And getting those stories out into the atmosphere, particularly those stories that have been marginalized, right? So it's another sort of internal, external question of asking ourselves in our context, how are we maintaining the status quo of unhealed wounds, the unhealed historical wounds in their legacy? How does history and story shape our identity, both positive and negative, right? And so because of the history of enslavement and genocide, how does that shape our experience today of being a person that is either a part of a group that has perpetuated these things, or part of a group that has been impacted by these things negative? How does that shape our ideas and our stories? And how do we make up stories to deal with that? How does history and false narratives impact current policies and maintain structures, right? And so this idea that, so we kind of have this North-South thing in this US, but the idea that our Civil War wasn't about keeping slavery or not keeping slavery was the big lie, right? That we've told ourselves in this country, amongst other lies, right? So unearthing those lies that the country has told themselves and the dominant culture has perpetuated in order to justify the inequities that actually exist in society, right? So we exist in one of denial because we can't really face this. And that denial has proliferated throughout our education system, throughout our history systems, throughout our own narratives about what happened and what's going on. And so in order to heal the wounds, we actually have to pull that denial back and look at it, look at the hurt and impact that has happened on both sides, right? How does that affect those who have been a part or complicit in perpetuating or benefit from that perpetuation? And how can we tell the story specifically of those who have been marginalized? And how do we come together to create shared narratives so that these things can coexist and that we can coexist with one another? So that's all about the beginnings of truth telling, both in our own hearts and our communities, but the narratives that we tell ourselves in society. So we have lots of monuments to people that really tried to preserve the enslavement of Africans in our country, all throughout the US. So we've been having a reckoning in our country about what those figures really stood for, and then now changing the narrative about tearing those down. Rob and his work began changing the narrative 10 years ago. And so what we like to do is to create experiential opportunities for both groups to walk through a history together. And we've done that through what we've called the Trail of Enslaved Africans, where we take both white folks and Black folks in all race or ethnicities in between that are part of our Trust Building Fellowship. And we have a Trail of Enslaved Africans that really tries to mirror the experience of Africans coming through the US. We had a huge slave market here in Richmond, and which was literally buried history till about 25 years ago. The history of that was buried in our history books and buried under a highway. So we had to uncover that history. Rob or friends of Rob's were a part of creating a trail where people can walk through and experience that history. So we made the invisible visible, and then we had people walk through that history together. And the experiential nature was really important, right? Because there's you telling me, but it's me going through that myself, whether either side that you're on. So it was truth telling. You know, part of that is telling the truth. We did it through our landscape and through our monuments and through the stories. But we had to acknowledge that there's repentance, forgiveness, restoration, repair, and accountability. So that is a long process, and it's not going to happen overnight, and you can't do it with everybody, right? So in our program, we had 25 people a year that were taking through this process, right? That's what we were focusing on. And then there, through different points in our history with initiatives of change, we brought the larger community into that narrative, and I'll give you some examples of that. So the picture on the left is T, one of our facilitators, walking folks through the Trail of Enslaved Africans. When we take folks through there, then we have a debrief about what does it feel like a Black person to have gone through that, right? And those are my ancestors who have gone through that. What does it feel like as a white person who is connected to the perpetuation of that history? What does it feel like folks that maybe knew immigrants to this country are not directly impacted by that history? So we're all in this. We had an experience together, we took it in, and then we have a chance to debrief our emotions about it. And that's when the healing kind of came. All sorts of stuff came up and was part of our dialogue. But that truth telling and acknowledgement was really, really important. And then on the picture on the right is basically a statue. It's the reconciliation statue. There's one in Benin, there's one in Liverpool, there's one in Richmond that represents the triangle trade of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And so that was unveiled as a monument. We have lots of monuments, and they're not to nice people in Richmond, they're just being taken down. But we have this monument to reconciliation because in Liverpool, they made the ships. In Benin, they filled the ships, and then they brought the folks to Richmond Shore. So that was just kind of this public example of reconciling, truth-telling, and healing, right? And Benin needed to heal from that history of selling their brothers and sisters to the slave trade. And Liverpool needed to heal from their part that they played in that. So those are just the two examples of walking through history and those narratives. Something else we do, which is really important, is walk people through a history timeline. So that is basically, we have a history. So you pick an event or people or something that you're going through. And what we have people do is create that timeline, right? And so it's really the timeline of where the trust was broken. So you can make it as long as it's short you want, but it's really a visual, and it could be hundreds of years, right? And then on the top, we say what is going on in the policy realm in our culture from a mega standpoint. At the bottom, what are the different narratives that are being told about that, right? And so you can have policies of, for us, it may be the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. What were the laws and policies, things that were happening in our nation over that? And then what were the different narratives and experience locally of how people were experiencing that? What are the stories we tell ourselves around that? So that we can get at not only what happened from a historical perspective, but how is that interpreted by different groups of people? How did people hear that, experience that? And what were the stories they told about that, right? Because that's part of the narrative change. Until we can get the stories we tell out in the open, and then some people need to hear that and tell them straight, and other people need to have their story told because they haven't been told, right? And that's part of the healing process, is getting out. So that helps people lay it out to say, what exactly are we talking about, and what actually happened, and how have different groups interpreted what has happened? So that is another mechanism. Again, we always try to get people to dialogue through experience, right? So we're not just talking about my opinion, but looking at the meta narrative, what's going on. And then the last thing I'll talk about is connecting history to data. So we have to look at the history, how history impacts the structures that continue to keep people trapped. Many well-intentioned people have no knowledge of policies that have allowed and continued for the subjugation of certain people, right? So that story you told Mangalam about what was going on, like how many people sort of know about that and are get that out of there, or that perspective. And so just getting those stories out there, but also matching them with data, right? So how does it connect to the impacts of that, right? And so here we did something. So every 10 years we do a census in the US. It basically says where we are, population, how did those things break down by race and poverty? And so we had an academic professor say, we had some laws in maybe the 30s, that begin in the 30s, that basically have resulted in pretty much then legal segregation, but now we pretty much live in segregated communities, Black, white, people live in enclaves. If you have an integrated neighborhood, it's kind of rare in the US, although they do exist. And so the question was, how did we get here, right? And so most people didn't know that the government actually created the problem. They actually created and funded segregated neighborhoods in every city all over the US. And those happen to be the way they segregated were created the impacts of poverty we had today. So we had a academic person who is a known truth teller look at that data over history through maps. And then he was able to show how those laws that the federal government enacted in the 30s, 40s, and 50s actually created concentrated poverty for Black and Brown communities and have led to the segregation of our communities today. So instead of saying like, oh, these communities just happen to be all Black and in poverty, and these communities just happen to be all white and rich, it just happened that way, right? It's just like how people wanted to live. We really were able to look at the data and the maps and the laws and uncover that lie and help people that were just living in this oblivious reality really know how we got here in our community. So he created a DVD where he was kind of giving a presentation, and there was a discussion guide. So we went to all over the community. They trained 40 facilitators in how to present, and to have dialogue around this data. And we gave presentations all over the community. So this is in African-American communities and white communities all over Richmond. So people can know, is that narrative change? How exactly did we get here? It was the laws and policies, the government that has created this division, also by race and economic, that still live in our communities today. So we were able to take the data, tell the story, and open the eyes of people, get people at the table, and to really have some good dialogue. There was media coverage, and because of the history of that discrimination, we have a high areas of concentrated poverty in Richmond, and the mayor's office created the Office of Community Wealth Building with the goal of reducing poverty, right? So that's just another way of how using history can help you, and uncovering it can not only promote dialogue, but narrative change and truth-telling that leads to healing, not only our personal healing, but the narratives in our community. So those who have been marginalized, their stories can say, our communities are not ravaged by poverty because we are less than, right? It's because it was intentional, it was brutal, and it was over time. So with that, I want to
Ebony,
go ahead.
Ebony, just before you go to this next little piece, look, can I just take 1 minute just to say that obviously the stories that we've been sharing are primarily from the United States because that's where we're from. But it's important to know, and some of you do know, that this is also going on in many other countries where they are also dealing with their difficult histories. So for example, working with teams in Quebec, Canada, for example. So there you have the whole history of the French and English, the Anglo-Francophone community, the First Nations, the indigenous people, right? And now the more recent immigrants, the new Canadians. That's a very important conversation that's going on where they're using these kind of tools to address that history, right? In Australia, the whole relationship with the first people there, the indigenous Australians, and the immigrant Australians, if we want to put it that way. I mean, that's good. That's the important dialogue that's happening. In Kenya, the team there took time to acknowledge some of the painful history. For example, up at Garissa University, where there was a terrible massacre took place some years back, taking time to mark that event, to spend time on that site to talk about what that means and so forth, and many other examples like that. So just to say, I just wanted to sort of say that while we may be talking about the United States, because that's our experience, these same tools are being applied, in many different contexts. Okay, Ebony, sorry, back to you.
No, and I think the question is, these are just some of the tools that we use to highlight the history so that it can be healed and it can be discussed and it can be talked about, right? And so these are just examples. And so the reflection is, and I'll put it into chat and say it, and then we'll give y'all some time to think about it in groups. What difficult history or story is not being told in your community or family? And how might you begin to tell that story, right? And so we do that. We've done that through small groups of people. We've done that in this community-wide effort that I just explained to you. It doesn't have to be either or, but what difficult history is not being told in your community? And how might you begin to tell that story? What is the history that's not being told or needs to be healed in your community? And how might you begin to tell the story? Would you do that with a couple of people? Is there some way to use data, to use experience? What might you do to begin to tell that story? Because the beginning of telling that story is the beginning of healing that, the impacts of that history. So we're gonna give y'all about 7 minutes in breakout groups, and then we'll come back and hopefully we'll hear some thoughts from you. So thank y'all, and would love for folks to share a little bit about your conversation. Where is the difficult story that needs to be told in your community? And even more importantly, what do you feel like, maybe from our examples or maybe from inspiration, how can you begin to tell that story? Maybe 1 or 2 people share? Any thoughts? Go ahead.
All right, so I think for me, I was in the group with Mr. Will Elliott, and it was kind of listening to what I was saying because I don't know why. But I think for me, in terms of the stories that probably were not told or that I would probably want to tell in a different light is the fact that in Nigeria here, we probably don't have a body of knowledge as to the exact history or the accurate figures or what has happened in the past. But we know that there's been a lot of civil, unrest, there's been a lot of communal clashes, a lot of wars in the past. But there seems to be no consensus as to what exactly happened, what caused it, and the number of casualties. And I was saying that we could probably learn from the RFC USA example of the Community Trust Building Fellowship or the Trust Racial Healing and Transformation Program, which is basically open to United States citizens. But I was saying that if we just open it up to the entire RFC network, maybe we could learn 1 or 2 things as to how it's been done and how we can actually adapt same to each locality or each countries. But I feel that, it's a story that is deeply rooted in culture. And it's a bit difficult to want to change culture by most of these stories unless you understand exactly what caused them and what the aftermath of those incidents were. So for me, it's, of course, I'll keep trying to tell people and try to engage in conversations, but it's difficult when you don't exactly know what exactly happened and how deeply rooted those things are. So, but I think in terms of learning and what we can do is if RFC USA could say, oh, this program about Community Trust Building Fellowship is open to RFC network, let's learn, let's go through this learning and we can actually get more knowledge on how to go about it in our local communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's kind of what's being done at this time. And I don't know if it's made to Nigeria, but this is a teaser of that program of kind of what we take people through. And then some of the examples that Rob mentioned are communities where it's basically this model that's being adapted for, because it's not the same issues here as anywhere else, right? It's unique to specific countries as well. But you're absolutely right. Part of the challenge may actually be uncovering that history. So as an example here, how long was the city of Richmond developed a slave trail commission for the city to say, we don't actually know about the history of whatever the first 150 years of how Richmond was impacted by the transatlantic slave trade. And so they got a couple of local people together, joining with historians to actually dig up that history, right? And so it may be, well, we actually need some folks to help us. And we had some academics and some community historians to dig up and unearth that particular history. And that was the beginning of the work. So it took 15 years maybe to get that work dug up and then actually like places in the community. So this is not easy work, but part of it actually may be, we don't know this history. In order to heal from it, we have to deeply know it. And how do we find people that we can join with so we can even explore and uncover that particular history? Maybe the first step of that work, right? Which could be collaborations. Who else would be interested in your community and uncovering that? So that's just one example of, you know, the first step that may be. Other folks, maybe one other person, what was the history that needs to be uncovered or told, and how might you try to move it forward? Any other thoughts?
Can I go?
Yes.
So one of the things that it came to my mind is during the Civil War in 2000, and what happened to the Tamils in the north. The government explicitly told the 3,000 civilians, I think, for them to go to a safe zone. You go there and you will be protected. So these people went there, but they were all killed. And then all what happened in that civil war situation, the public doesn't know. The majority of the Sinhalese people do not know the wrongdoings done to this during the Civil War, how the hospitals were bombed, so many other things. But if the civilians know the truth, this is what happened, I am sure the Sinhalese people, they are good people. They will have compassion and empathy, and, you know, something could have been done. So that is one thing. So and the other question is that how do you, so the truth telling is so important. How might you begin to tell this history? So, and I shared a little bit, I did my PhD, Forgiveness and Reconciliation theme. I need to do a component, research component. So what I did was I took 10 Sinhalese and 10 Tamils separately, prepared them, brought them together and allowed them to say the story. And of course, I was so scared, but things might come up. And then I had a conflict resolution mediator there. But then they shared the story very respectfully, patiently, they listened to each other. And the Sinhalese said, this is the first time we heard their suffering from the victim themselves. And the Sinhalese said, my goodness, this is the first time we heard from the Sinhalese that they too have suffered. See, the impression is only the Tamil have suffered, but the Sinhalese too have suffered, right? So for me, that was an enlightenment, and there was change, because people, they were trying to understand each other, a small 10 groups of people. But then I know this is one of the best way of doing things. But how to get the people? That's the problem. Nobody agrees, because this is a component, research component, and several people tried to get these 10 people. I spend 6 or 7 times from Ottawa to come to Toronto and spend all the hours during the day to meet people, and got only 10 and 10 people. And not only I did, several other people helped in the recruitment. But now my problem, I am a single person. To find like-minded people like me to do, at least to find 2 people to work with me is difficult. I can't do that. Yeah. That is the problem, is that we can try certain things, but then how to get the people interested? People, right-minded people.
Yeah, I think that is a real challenge. And maybe you want to talk just a little bit before we move to the next section, Rob, on how you all were able to get people interested or recruited in some of the trust building activities in the U.S.
Yes, and I think you've identified a really important challenge, because I always find that the most difficult thing is actually getting the right people in the room to have the conversation. That takes a lot of work. And so I don't think there's any easy way to do that. I think it's certainly helpful if you have some allies who can work with you. And we should talk more. Maybe offline we can have some more conversation about how that can happen, because that is really the critical question, is how to do that. And I don't know. I mean, there are other people doing trust building work in Canada who, I don't know whether you're in touch with them at all, but we ought to make sure that you are.
Yes, in Quebec, for example,
Yes,
I didn't follow you. I met you there for the first time when they had the meeting, and and there again, to, I don't know how far, that people, I don't want to talk about that experience, but it's difficult, as you say.
It is difficult.
It is difficult. Very
and there's
difficult.
a team, I mean, Talia may want to speak to this also, but I mean, there is a small team in Sri Lanka, which is starting to do some trust building work. And it'd be interesting to know to what extent they are addressing specifically the issues that you're talking about.
Thank you. I did talk to Suresh about this too, but I think I need more help, sort of, I can't do alone, but maybe to connect, as you say, to several other people. I recently came to know Mohan from Australia.
Good.
And he just yesterday we connected, Richard connected both of us. So maybe slowly meeting with these people may have I am really discouraged, to be honest with you. And I don't want to waste my time. I might not live only for a few more years. So before that, I want to do something. Hopefully, Rob, I may need your help, perhaps, after.
Don't be discouraged. We'll talk some more. Absolutely, we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
So we're running short on time, but thank you, Mangalam. And maybe you and Rob can have a more detailed offline conversation, because that's definitely a huge issue, right? How do you? And part of our last two things or the last one is thinking about building a team. It's important. You can't do this work by yourself. But I think the beginning part of what you were talking about is exactly a good segue about how do you engage people in honest conversation. And so our way of doing that has been through promoting dialogue between different groups. Exactly as you have said, it's almost sort of, it's a precursor to this conversation. And I'll go through this quickly because we're short on time. But, most of the time, we're as groups that are either been hurt or perpetuators of hurts, whether physical or emotional or economic, we usually end up debating one another, right? And so this is just kind of a chart we use to say, debate is about trying to get your point across and prove somebody wrong and win, and it's like an either or. Dialogue is trying to hear different perspectives on the same issue or experience, people sharing their experiencing. It's about listening. It's about re-examining our positions, not being stuck in our previous position and trying to convert somebody else, right? And so dialogue is this creating this spaciousness by which we can tell our stories, our experiences, and then figure out what is the work we might do together, right? And so it's a different orientation where I'm not trying to convince you of anything, and we're inherently trying to create space for lots of different perspectives to live and just be in that space. So that's kind of how we like to differentiate those things and move in a space of spaciousness, of providing different experience and perspectives, and for us to really deeply hear and listen to one another. And the dialogue that you talked about with the groups of 10 folks is exactly the model that we try to use. So again, preparing for dialogue, what conversations are not taking place, right? You can think about between what groups or even within groups, there may be dialogues that need to be placed. Who needs to be at the table and how do you get them there? Now, I will tell you, the how do you get them there, right, is hard. But what we try to do is say, who is kind of on the edge of both of those groups that will be willing to sit down? So if people are like this far apart, they're probably not going to be able to sit down. But who is open, that may be a part that represents those divisions, that may be able to stick their toe out and say, yes, I'm willing to talk about this, even though I'm part of what may seem as the other or opposing group. So we like to have 4 parts to a dialogue, right? And it's really first grounding people and why they're there. A colleague of ours says when people are grounded in the purpose, then they're able to stay, right? I stay in a room when it gets hard because I'm grounded in the purpose there is strong enough to keep me there. So we like to usually do about 4 questions for each dialogue based on the group, and we ground people and why they're there. We create common agreements of how we're going to listen to one another, provide like respect, basically creating the container of how we're going to move together. We then get people to share their personal experience, right? So it's not really about sharing your opinion, but tell me an experience that you have as a whatever person, right? So we're really able to hear one another's stories and the impact personally without getting bogged down about this is my opinion on the matter. Because you can't really refute somebody's experience. It's their experience, right? You just kind of have to live and let it be. The third portion is what is the meaning of these experiences in the context of the community? So that is really trying to synthesize what do we do with the reality that we have very different experiences, right? What do we do with that? And then we just talk about that. Like, what is the meaning? You know, how this hearing these other experiences has impacted one another. And then before we leave, we say, well, what have you learned? And what might we do what we've learned? And sometimes that says like, what is the work we might do together, right? So you start with grounding people, you get people to share their experiences, you try to make meaning of those differing experiences. And then you try to say, what is the work that we might do together? What did we learn, right? And so that's just saying, it may be the work we might do together is meet again. But if you just leave sharing experience, you want to say that this just haven't been for naught. Like, I'm not just coming here to share. What may we do? And the what may we do could be as simple as let's meet again, right? Or let me draft somebody else that I think would be good for this process. It doesn't have to be big overarching things. It could be just for the group, right? And so getting those people that are ripe to go to the next step is really important part of the dialogue. And we usually do this in an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe conversation with about 10, no more than 12 people in groups. Or you can have a bigger dialogue, but the groups are always broken down in groups of but 10, no more than 12 people. So you can have a conversation. Sometimes within groups, you actually need to have an honest conversation. So sometimes you may not actually be ready to go and talk to a group outside. You may need the people within the group to have an honest conversation in and of themselves. There may be infighting, there may be conflict, there may be difference of an opinion. You may do a dialogue with your staff because people are kind of all over the place and you haven't done that. Right now in the US, there's been a lot of talking about race. That's our thing here. And I've done a lot of dialogues just between staffs at different organizations who have never shared their experiences with one another, right? And so that's within a group. They work in the same organization, same charitable mission, but they're all over the place and kind of reeling from everything that's going on. And so this could be, what can be done in our group, and then, what do we need to hear from the other group to begin to build trust, right? So those are 2 ways to think about dialogue. And I'm actually not going to, we're all short on time, so I'm not going to go in a small group. So just kind of want a quick response. Have you ever been a part of the dialogue? Did it work or not work? And if you were, was it within group or between groups? Sort of anybody, particularly somebody who hasn't spoken. Ever been a part of a dialogue? Did it work or not work? And was it within your a particular group or between groups? Anybody? Yes, go ahead, Marianne. Unmute yourself.
I've been part of several. The one that I'm looking for, which we need now in Switzerland, and which I don't quite know how to go about it, is that we have different cultures, languages. We've had dialogues; they have worked. There has been some trust built. There are always jokes about each other and preconceived ideas, but nothing hurtful, compared to other places. However, when people come from outside, migrants, refugees, even people who come to work here, then suddenly everybody is like one block. and doesn't trust those who come from outside.
Right. Yeah.
And this increases hugely just now. So this is what has not worked so far. Lots of groups try, but we never get the ones that should sit at the table with your question. You know, the ones that are tough, the ones that say, no, these are lazy. They always are like this or like that.
Yeah, those are, you may get a different strategy for them. Those are probably not the people that are going to initially come to a dialogue. So you may say, I'm going to get the people that may be in relationship with those people, because the people that are likely going to come to the dialogue are not the extremists, right? But it may be one of the people that come to the dialogue that has a relationship with them that can then build that and bring them over. But that's probably not going to, from my experience, and Rob, you may have something. The most extreme people, because dialogue presumes that there's a level of openness, right? It's usually those folks at the extreme are not open. But if you can get people that have relationship with them, I think that's how you build. You get those people in the room, and then they're transformed, and they can transform or work on transforming people that they know that they already have trust with. You sort of see what I'm saying? And then maybe there's an intergroup dialogue that happens where people are not on the defensive or whatever, or that may be like your second or third wave of people, to get the first wave of people and say, you may even ask them, you're in relationship with people, they're on the extreme. What can we do as part of helping them come to these tables or bring them along? Or how could we equip you to do that? For them to maybe host dialogues within their communities. But I think as a first step, it would be really hard to get the more extreme people as part of that conversation. Other thoughts? Go ahead, Will.
You're muted.
Just very quickly, 15 years ago, my wife and I were feeling quite nervous about a huge housing development coming in near us that was going to take down 65 houses and put in about 2,500 people. And so the short bullet point or lesson learned that I wanted to bring to you, Ebony and Rob, and everyone else, is that as I think back to it, maybe 20 of us gathered in the basement of another community who was also being affected. And one of the people who was meeting, that complete stranger, that person had in their heritage some ancestors from our Native American heritage in the United States. And it was so meaningful that there's a tradition of passing the peace pipe.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that in a very peaceful, quiet, respectful way, and allowed every person to, I think, feel respected and honored and to express what they wanted to. And I think that initial grounding, which we did several more times, held us in harmony during 2 years of hot and heavy battling with our governmental representatives who we didn't feel always represented us. So I just feel that initial coming together as human beings and each person coming to an understanding of the other is, and I guess you could say love was in the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes I find in my work, and then we'll have to, thank you for sharing that, Will, right? So that's another example. And some people, it's like a talking stick. When you're doing dialogue, you sort of give it to folks and then you have the mic and everybody else is paying attention. I think sometimes service or projects may actually be a way to get people in dialogue, but not in a scripted way of like, I actually built relationships where I'm working on something together, right? Or experiencing something together. So these constructed ways of being together in community where it may be just an introduction where maybe I'm not trying to, because dialogues, you have to be kind of vulnerable in sharing your experience. So are there ways in which to have that where we're actually just building relationships with people that are different for us, before I'm open and willing and able to sit down around a table and really be vulnerable. And I found that sometimes that just like, we're going to do something and not talk about the difficult things first in order to build a relationship to talk about the difficult things, right? Because I was just listening to this podcast this morning, and sometimes until we get the love in the room, we can't have those hard conversations because they're not grounded on love, right? They're grounded on anger or hurt or something else. So how do we get the love in the room? And Will, I think that's a good example of that grounding, just grounded you all in peace so that you can have a human level conversation. But sometimes you need to do other things to get the love between people in the room per se, before you can sit down and really be open enough to get to that level of vulnerability. So that's kind of our spiel about dialogue. It can be a tool. It's not going to work for every situation. But I think grounding people to share their experiences is a very powerful way to at least get to hear one another. Because sometimes it's like people are not even open to change until they've heard or able to speak what has been on their heart. And then once that's been cleared up, there's so much more space for creativity and problem solving. But just getting that out in the air, I think, provides a space. So it's not a solution for everything, but it could be a mechanism to build trust within groups and between groups. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob, and he's going to wrap up with talking about building teams.
Our final piece really is talking about how do we build and sustain a diverse team and network. I think it's fair to say that team building is often the most neglected part of community organizing. A friend of mine often says that movements do not fail from the outside, they always fail from the inside. And I know from my own experience, I mean, I've worked in many difficult situations with many polarized groups, but honestly speaking, my most difficult experiences have always been with my own colleagues, with my own team. And how do you build those honest relationships within people we're working with? Sigmund Rhee was from North Korea. He escaped from North Korea in the 1950s. He came to the United States, became a Presbyterian minister. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement, became the moderator of the Presbyterian Church USA, and really devoted his life to reconciliation efforts between North and South Korea. And Sigmund was a great mentor to myself and many others in the trust building work. And he used to say, you know, one stick does not make a strong fire. He says, if we're going to carry on a vision for justice and peace, we must learn to be a team. However brave and talented I may be, without a container or a framework, compassion and commitment can become wrongly directed. So how do we do that? And our team needs to demonstrate the change and the relationship it wants to see in the wider community, right? The team that's trying to bring about change needs to be a demonstration of that change for the wider community. How do we engage people of different or opposing views as potential allies? And how do we build partnerships that serve others without a personal agenda or a need for credit? Now, a team needs a lot of different skills and aptitudes. You know, in any team, you need visionaries, but you also need managers. You need thinkers and nurturers. You need people who can present and speak. You need facilitators. You need activators, activists, and innovators. There are many skills that go into building a team. And also, you know, not only skills, but people of different temperaments, different cultures, different experiences. And that could be a challenge also. I was in Australia some years back with a colleague, and we were walking, I think it was in Sydney, and we came across this big billboard, this big advertisement. I don't know what they were advertising, but the billboard said, pearls are formed around points of irritation. Pearls are formed around points of irritation. And you all know how a pearl is formed, right? That sand gets under the shell of the oyster and it irritates it and it irritates it. And eventually the result is a pearl. But the point is you don't get to the pearl without that irritation. So our willingness as team builders to go through what is sometimes a frustrating, exhausting, but ultimately rewarding experience is really important. And there are many different types of teams and networks. I mean, there are project, organizational teams, partnerships, coalitions, local, national, and international. But I want to look at two ways of looking at the team. One is what we might call a core team of close-knit group of activists who are dedicated to a specific task with a shared vision and values. And it may be time limited, but it's a very specific project that this team is trying to accomplish. We might call that an explicit team. And then there are networks which are more implicit. I mean, these are community-wide networks of people who are carrying forward maybe different enterprises, but they're also connected by shared values and vision. And this is the important thing, that whether it's a core team or whether it's a network, there are shared values and vision which hold it together. And I think both of these aspects are really helpful. And I think as you go forward in this work, there's always going to be those two aspects to it. So I'd like to just very quickly look at three different ways of looking at this. And I call this discovering the team, because my experience is that the team is already there. It's just waiting to be discovered. And so our job is to discover who is the team, right? So one way of looking at this is living to make the other person great. How might I enable others to make their best contribution? So is there someone in my team who might welcome my support, for example, right? And, or is there someone in the wider community who's doing potentially important work and who needs support? How might I or we support them? So this whole theme of living to make the other person great, helping them to achieve their highest potential, their goals, is one aspect. Second is seeking support, because are there people in my team or the wider community who can give me or us support? We don't have all the skills, the experiences we need. None of us do. So is there someone who could be a personal resource for me, who can give me advice? I have some people who I regard as valued mentors who I turn to when I feel stuck, Also, are there people in the wider community who might be resources for our collaborative efforts? These might be people with funding access. It might be people who have access to different organizations and contacts and so forth. So seeking support. And then thirdly, engaging hard to reach people. How do we respond positively to challenging people or groups? Maybe there's somebody in my team who presents difficulties for me or for others. How might I respond to that person differently? Someone in the wider community who is blocking constructive change. How might they be approached as potential allies? I mean, a striking example of that in Richmond was our local newspaper, the one daily newspaper that we had, was known as a very unhelpful organization. It had supported segregation throughout the years. For many people, it was enemy number one in the community. But it was the only newspaper that we had. So we said to ourselves, how do we make an ally out of this newspaper? And so we sent a diverse team to go and meet with the senior editors, and we said to them, we have a vision that this city, if it's willing to have honest conversation about its issues, could become a leader for racial healing for this country. And we invite you at the newspaper to be part of that. And they were very astonished, because they were used to being attacked And so the result was they began to participate. They began to take part in our dialogues. They began to report on what was happening, and their whole news coverage actually began to change. We ended up co-sponsoring public forums with them. But it was an important experience, really, of, you might say, addressing, connecting with an institution that appeared to be a problem and turning that into an ally. So for our sort of reflection period, we're just going to take a few minutes of this. Elaine, I think we'll go into pairs for 2 people each in this one. A couple of questions to think about. Is there someone in my team who might welcome my support? Or is there someone in the wider community who's doing potentially important work? How might I or we support them? Secondly, is there someone in my team who I find difficult to work with? Or it could be a work colleague at your office or wherever. How might I deal with them differently? And is there someone in the wider community, in the public arena, who appears to be an obstacle to constructive change? How could they be approached as a potential ally? Let's just take a minute to reflect on this, and then we'll just do a sort of open conversation for anybody who would like to reflect on that. Okay.
Thank you, Rob. First, can I say that it's really been an excellent program, and I'm grateful for both Ebony and your guiding us and giving us a new set of tools to work with. Very briefly, I'm involved in an organization, and without going into too much detail, we've had to change our policy with regards to conducting funerals. I'm because of COVID-19 and all the safety issues, but I'm convinced that it is possible to now start to release or to relax some of those restrictions. And unfortunately, as much as I try to negotiate with the person who has the authority, this is not the government, but this is the person in the cemetery itself, I keep getting contradictory messages. So on the surface, they're saying to me, oh yeah, Jeff, that's great, we want to help you. And then behind my back, they're writing emails saying, absolutely not, this is never going to happen over my dead body. So that's my challenge.
Thank you for sharing that. That's I think we've all experienced things like that from time to time. So that's thank you, Jeff. Yes, Fatima, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm from India, associated with IOC and located in Bombay. We have a IOC home in Bombay, which is Kumaram. Probably most of you must have seen it and lived in that. So now we have started hosting a program called Dialogue on Diversity, because Indian society is getting polarized day by day increasingly, not only in the communal sense, in regional, in the language, in food habits, in only vegetarian housing societies. And that's a cause of concern for us. So we have started this dialogue where in Kumaram we host the meetings and we provide them very safe space to just express their opinions on different issues. And we just provide the listening ear. So we have just started that, and that's why I've joined this course to learn a little more. How do I deal with the difficult situations? These definitely are going to come my way when we have started this dialogue on diversity.
Right. Thank you, Fatima. Anybody else? Talia, you wanted to say a word about resources available? That might be useful just to share with people.
Yeah, I just put some links to our Trust Building Program's Knowledge Hub, which has different resources and best practices in delivering just different trust building work in your community. So you can take a look at that. And that we run several other different webinars and training events. We've got our next session called Becoming a Trust Builder in Practice, and that's on the 6th and 7th of April. So if you could, whichever email you've got from us, you can just let us know and you can register for that. But I think that's all. Thank you, Rob. Yeah, thank you, Ebony, very much for this session. It's, I mean, I know that you do you take people through weekends of this work. So when we were saying it's a 2-hour, just a taster, you know, I think you did such a wonderful job of presenting, you know, the trust building programs framework, and giving us just, as you said, like a toe into some of the reflection points, particularly as what we need to do ourselves as trust builders. So thank you very much, because I think it was very valuable. And yeah, I'm sure lots of people going away with a lot more other things to get thinking and working and contemplating, because it was, yeah, good session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talia. So here's a, you can take this away with you. Just sort of reflection questions, reflection and action. What will I do? Is there some change I can make in my life to be a better trust builder? Is there some story or history to share, or some wound to heal? Is there a person that I will reach out to, and others I can work with? Okay, so those are just sort of 4 things to sort of think about as you leave here. But it's been great being with you all. I know Ebony and I have thoroughly enjoyed. It's frustrating that we don't have more time to sort of hear from you all, but it's also fascinating to learn what you're all doing. And you know, I hope that we can continue to stay in touch, because we all learn from each other, you know. Ebony, any closing words from you?
Nope, I think this has been great. Hopefully it's been helpful. And I think it's, you know, hopefully you got some inspiration from this content, right? This is not going to necessarily solve your problems, but is there a new way of thinking, being, insight, thought, personal reflection that'll lead you to the next move? And sometimes, as one of my colleagues said, can I do the next right thing, right? So hopefully maybe can you figure out what's your next right thing maybe? Because that's really all that we have. So hopefully this has inspired you to maybe your next right thing, or maybe some creativity or innovation. And if that's what's achieved, then I think we're happy and it was successful. But it was good to meet you all.
Same here. Thank
Right.
you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care.